Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute weekly show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM. And if you don't live in the Santa Fe area, you can listen. It streams live from ksfr.org, so you won't miss a show. Today, I'll be speaking with Robert Jensen, an author, blogger, and environmental activist. With Wes Jackson, he is the co-author of An Inconvenient Apocalypse, Environmental Collapse, Climate Crisis, and the Fate of Humanity. That's a big topic. And he also publishes a very compelling and personal blog on his experience of our unfolding climate crisis. We'll get to Bob in just a moment, but first, a few short announcements. Last week, I interviewed an Israeli-American author, podcaster, advocate for Palestinian justice, Miko Peled. Miko Peled was visiting New Mexico last week, speaking about the Palestinian crisis and how he was raised in an Israeli Zionist family with an Israeli general father, and yet emerged to oppose the apartheid state in Israel. The conversation was rich. I want to remind you that if you're listening to this show while driving around town and miss any of the show, you can watch the full YouTube recording of this show and any prior interview by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and clicking on the Retake on the Radio button on the lower right-hand side of the homepage. You'll find the recordings of all of our previous shows listed in chronological order. Retake takes pride in delivering compelling interviews on important topics. So when on the Retake on the Radio page, take a little bit of time to review old interviews too. You might find something of interest. And the irony is not lost on me that what you will find is video recordings on Retake on the Radio. So in any case, the session is over, but we are not done. Next week, Roxanne and I will do a part two of our Retake session debrief, with a focus on what didn't get done and what we must do differently if we want better results. As usual, climate bills were barely able to even pass a single committee. We'll talk about all of that next week at our huddle on Wednesday, April 5th at 6 p.m. And because we have so much to discuss, we are extending the Zoom to 7:30, so we'll have a full 90 minutes for conversation. And you can get more information on the huddle and a link to register by going to retakeourdemocracy.org, clicking on the actions and events in the menu bar, and you'll land on a page with information about the Zoom huddle right at the top of the page. You must register to participate, so join us and learn more about how the legislature works and how you can lobby effectively. Before we get started, I also want to acknowledge that we are conducting the show on stolen Tewa land, and I want to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of the land. We could learn from their custodial caring for the land, water, and air. And we better learn it fast, and not just learn it, but enact it. Okay, let's get started. Welcome, Bob. I'm very excited about doing this interview.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's a real honor to be with you.
Okay. I always like to let our guests introduce themselves. So how about you take a couple of minutes to tell us who you are, what brought you to New Mexico, and how you got involved in podcasting and writing about environmental issues.
Well, I'm just a simple boy from North Dakota who had a fair amount of luck in his life. I started out as a newspaper reporter and editor, shifted into university teaching. I spent 26 years at the University of Texas in Austin and retired in 2018, and then did my best to get out of the state of Texas as quickly as possible. My wife and I moved to Arroyo Seco here, just outside of Taos, in 2020, and we've been here ever since. So I'm a retired professor, happily living in the mountains for the first time in my life.
Well, and your wife is?
My wife is Eliza Gilkison, who many people listening will probably know because she has a long history in New Mexico, going back to her first years as a performer. She's a singer-songwriter, has been all over the place since those early days in New Mexico. But as people can certainly understand, she always wanted to come back. Everybody, I think, wants to eventually come back to New Mexico. And so she continues to record. In fact, as we're talking today, she's up in Alamosa, Colorado with her producer, working on a new record. And so Uh, like I said, for a North Dakota boy, the mountains are a little bit of a change. For Eliza, it's coming home.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you're here. And I look forward to actually meeting you in the flesh. Since I had not read your book, I migrated to your blog page so I could get prepared for the interview. And I took a look at a few pieces, most particularly Milling Around, a philosophy of life for a time of ecological collapse. And I found this quote that I'd like to offer up for us to discuss. It's not accurate to say that we all know the problems, even among like minded people. For example, there are deep divides in the environmental movement over how to understand the problems that emerge from the multiple cascading crises we face. And boy, do we experience that in Santa Fe. Some very different perspectives. Different analysis lead to different assessments, and those differences are not trivial. Take the question of transportation. We believe the real problem is a car-based culture, while some environmentalists think the main problem is cars that burn petroleum. We see a limited role for electric cars so long as they don't divert attention from the need to dramatically reduce individual car travel. So I just wanted to comment that from this one quote, I knew the two of us saw the climate catastrophe as more about consumption, capitalism, and greed than about emissions. First, am I right in my understanding of the root causes of the climate crisis? And
Well,
secondly, if I am right, can you talk about your reasons for not seeing the electric car as central to our climate challenge?
sure. Let me go back to that first phrase, the milling around philosophy of life. That comes from Wes Jackson, my co-author. I often describe Wes as the most important environmentalist a lot of people have never heard of. Wes is in his 80s. He's been working on these problems for more than a half century now. He's a co-founder of an important sustainable ag institution, the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, and a real inspiration to me. I've learned a lot from Wes over the years. And Wes says that we have to adopt a milling around philosophy of life, which he describes as finding a way to mill around, amuse ourselves, and live cheap till we die. In other words, to lower our expectations in this high energy, high technology world. And that goes to the core of the message of an inconvenient apocalypse, which is we have to start accepting and imposing on ourselves collectively limits, right? That we can't continue the high energy, high technology society of the modern world, even with an expansion of renewable energy. And so the car question, I think, is a good one because I'm all for electric vehicles and replacing gas burning cars. But the fact is, we have to think about a lot less travel. We have to think about human beings staying put, milling around, live cheap till you die. That's the kind of main focus of the book. I often say if you want to reduce this book, An Inconvenient Apocalypse, to a bumper sticker, it's the phrase fewer and less. We have to start thinking about how to transition to a world with fewer people consuming less energy and other material resources. And that goes against the grain, obviously, of a modern capitalist consumer culture. And that modern capitalist consumer culture, is not just endorsed in the boardrooms of corporations. It's part of our existence. It's the water we swim in. And so I often find myself at odds with environmentalists who say, well, if we can just electrify everything, we'll be fine. And I think both the data and common sense suggest that's not a viable option. Now, I don't want to pretend I have a grand solution to all this. It's a tough road ahead. But until we can tell the truth about the need for fewer and less, Wes and I believe we're not going to make much progress.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I almost said I couldn't disagree, but I meant I couldn't agree with you more. And I don't want to make too much of one essay, but it does seem that in milling around a philosophy of life for a time of ecological collapse, you've sort of given up on the existing system. And that's sort of what we're saying here, the capitalist system and traditional approaches. How would you characterize the existing system and why is it not workable? And then you offer a vision of what will be after the ecological collapse. And you describe that as a saving remnant. And I'm wondering if you could describe what your view of a saving remnant is.
Yeah, that's an important, both of those aspects of this are important. So the problem with capitalism is sort of self-evident. It's an economic system premised on endless growth on a finite planet, and we know that that can't go on forever. Um, Advances in technology have allowed us to embrace the illusion that we're able to do this indefinitely, but I think we all know it can't go on. And of course, within capitalism, you have an incredibly obscene disparity in the distribution of wealth. So on both ecological and moral dimensions, I think capitalism is a failed system. I do want to make the point also, though, that simply adoption of a more, let's, for the sake of simplicity, call it a democratic socialist system, doesn't get us out of the ecological crises. Right? There's no guarantee that when we've all become used to this high energy, high technology world, that a more democratic, more socialist, a more democratic polity and a more socialist economy is going to make it easy. I don't think it will. So capitalism has put us on this road to the cliff, and it's not easy to figure out how to slow the engine, let alone turn it around. But that's our task. Now, we want to believe that all of this can be done. It can be done in a time frame that minimizes human suffering and ecological degradation. But another thing Wes and I believe we have to come to terms with is the fact that there's really no indication we are going to be able to slow the machine in time. And that means that whether we like it or not, we are moving toward a world of fewer people and less consumption. But it's not necessarily going to be on our terms. And so Wes, who's a fan of biblical metaphors, especially, identified a long time ago this concept is primarily from the Hebrew Bible, although we're using it in a very secular way, the question of a saving remnant. So, in the Hebrew Bible, you've got the covenant between Israel and God, and people are always messing up. And you get this concept of no matter how bad the people of Israel mess up, there will always be those who carry forward the covenant. There will be this saving remnant. And Wes and I think that's a good metaphor for thinking about what's on the other side of this high energy, high technology world. Right? And so in addition to trying to affect public policy today, which I think is incredibly crucial, you mentioned, climate bills in the New Mexico legislature or at the federal government level. All of that's important. But we also have to start thinking now about what's on the other side and starting to develop a culture that can endure. And that's what we mean by a saving remnant. In the book, we talk about the need to develop skills, stories, and spaces for a different kind of world, skills for a low energy world. I don't think in a low energy world anybody's going to need a video game designer, right? But we're going to need a lot of people who know how to stitch together the crumbling infrastructure of the industrial world. Those are skills that we're going to have to develop. Skills at food preparation and all of the things that are required in a low energy world. We're going to have to create new spaces for people to come together. We're not going to be online. We're not going to be in some of the spaces that we currently occupy. Things are going to become more local. And of course, stories are important for any human endeavor. We have to tell stories about what it means to live a good life and what it means to be a person. A lot of the stories that we tell in this culture are about heroes, sports heroes and movie actors and rich people. And those are stories that aren't going to be very useful in a low energy world, what Wes calls the down powering world. So the saving remnant is hard to specify, what's it going to be like in 100 years? But we can start thinking about those skills, spaces, and stories we're going to need in that down powering world. And that's part of what we argue in the book.
So it's interesting. You and I talked about this a little bit yesterday because this is something Roxanne and I have talked about a great deal. And that is the idea of buying some land, defensible and where you could sustainably grow food and survive. And it's sort of like a survivalist thing. And then when we were talking, I was going like, you couldn't pick a less likely human being than me to be a survivalist. I don't know how to use tools. Roxanne fixes everything. I've never touched a gun. I mean, the idea of having a defensible space suggests that there would come a time that I would take a gun and defend my property or my life and my family with weapons, and it's just like so foreign to me. How do
Yeah,
you sync that? I'm assuming you've encountered a similar kind of
yeah.
like aha moment. How do you
Yeah.
process that?
Well, first of all, I would distinguish between the typical conception of survivalist, which is kind of a lone, guy defending his property. Sometimes they use the word prepper, people who are preparing for the collapse. Uh, I don't think there's any future in that kind of survivalism. I'm talking, and Wes and I are talking about community survivalism, right? Recognizing that when the existing infrastructure is no longer available, we're just not going to have the energy, to truck food across the country and things like that. We're going to have to go back to the way humans have lived most of our evolutionary history, which is relying on each other. And in that, I don't think everybody needs to have every skill. So,
Oh,
like
good.
you,
I don't have to get a gun.
but like you, I'm not a terribly handy person. But I now live, in a more rural area. I'm part of our Acequia Association. I see the distribution of skills and talents in the community, and I know where I can contribute. I know how to dig a ditch. I might not be able to fix the plumbing, but I can dig the hole to get down to the plumbing. That's, a distribution of talents. And I'm learning that my most important skill since I moved to rural New Mexico probably is with a shovel. Okay, so we all don't have to be able to, uh, shoot a deer and skin a deer and grow our own food. We need to be working collaboratively in communities where people care about each other. And I think that's a different conception of survivalism. Now, you mentioned land, and of course, what's most important, the source of, real wealth in the world in an absolute sense is productive land and the ability to work it. And that's another thing that I think of not necessarily in individual terms, but in community terms. And I think all over the world, people are starting to think about these things. Community land trusts, cooperative associations. I was talking to someone in Arroyo Seco about the idea of a community orchard maintenance. There's a lot of fruit trees around here, and not all of them are harvested. So why not get people together and harvest the fruit from trees that are currently not being used, and then share those with the community? Those are the kind of ideas that I think are going to be really crucial in the future. And the more we start thinking about it, making those connections today, I think the easier it will be when times get tough.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. We're going to need to take a quick break here just for a second here and to remind our listeners that they're listening to KSFR. And it's at times like this where misinformation is rampant, whether you're looking in mainstream media, social media, or political rhetoric. In all of those contexts, the truth is hard to find. But in the face of this misinformation, there is KSFR offering timely news and alerts and a wide range of programming to keep you informed and sane in these ever so challenging times. In an era replete with misinformation, at KSFR you get the straight scoop, fact-based news from Amy Goodman on Democracy Now!, the BBC, and KSFR's own state and local news. You get great music and informative discussions on timely issues from Economic Update and Richard Wolff, Retake Our Democracy, and a host of other moderated discussions. If you appreciate this kind of programming, after you finish listening to this show, please go to ksfr.org and click on the donate button and toss them $10, $20, or even $50, and think of it as your ticket for admission to a wealth of welcome programming. On behalf of KSFR, I want to thank you for your generosity. Now let's get back to our conversation with Bob Jensen. Well, Bob, we're painting a kind of difficult time ahead. I mean, one of the things that I mentioned to you that I had read recently, that you also found to be a compelling book, was The Parable of the Sower.
Mhm.
and by Octavia Butler. Can you that portrays a kind of um, Arwinian survivalist future where capitalism has collapsed, the democracy has collapsed. There's a neo-Nazi, neo-fascist anyway,
Mhm.
president, and marauding Christian gangs that will plunder anyone with food and water. It was really dystopic.
Yeah.
And I'm hearing, and people didn't do very well on their own, and so they did gather
Mhm.
in community, and that didn't end well either. But I'm guessing that that's the kind of thing you're looking at. The people will recognize that the fabric, the social fabric, is coming apart, and we need to coalesce among like-minded people and make this work. What I found interesting in your article was how you you made size of the community very important. It's
Mhm.
like at some point we have to be able to have a conception of we, and we've lost that.
Mhm.
And when you live in isolation or in a big bustling urban metropolis, the sense of we and connectedness tends to disappear.
Yeah.
How do you see the we emerging?
That's an important part. And again, it goes to the heart of this book. In one chapter, Wes and I talk about the four hard questions, which are size, scale, scope, and speed. And you just mentioned the second of those, scale. So size, we already talked about. What is a sustainable size of a human population at what level of material consumption? That's a tough one. But scale is a tough one too. Right now, we live in cities of millions of people, nation states of hundreds of millions of people. And we have to recognize as a species, we didn't evolve in cities and nations of that size. In fact, those concepts were very foreign for most of human history. We evolved as a foraging people, hunters and gatherers, in band level societies that usually were probably not more than 50 to 100 people. That's how we grew up as a species. And not surprisingly, that's how we're wired. There's a lot of psychology that demonstrates this. So I used to tell my students at the University of Texas in a large lecture class I taught that had 300 students, I would say, listen, if you feel awkward and uncomfortable in this big lecture hall with all these people, that's not a surprise. In fact, that's normal because I said there are more people in this lecture hall than you would have met in your entire life through most of human history. So we're in these political and social units that are, in a way, too big for us. And we're going to have to find what is the workable scale of a human community. Well, it's probably not going to go back to 25 to 50 people. There's just too many of us. But we do have to organize ourselves at a different level. It doesn't mean today I'm arguing we should abandon trying to affect federal policy in Washington. But over the long term and looking toward that saving remnant, we're going to have workable scale social organizations. And that's not what most of the world looks like today.
No.
And so, these are the kind of hard questions, hard because, of course, Wes and I don't have an answer. I can't pull a notebook off the shelf and hand you it with the 12 steps toward a workable, sustainable society.
Oh, that
But the
was the
fact
next question.
but the fact that we don't have easy answers doesn't mean we can avoid hard questions.
Right.
The third and fourth questions are the scope of human competence to run this high technology, high energy society. And we have to recognize that we're very clever as a species. We're smart. We can create all of this technology, but typically we can't control the unintended consequences of it. That's the story of climate change. And then the speed, and this is really probably the hardest question. At what speed do we have to start making dramatic changes to our social and economic lives to avoid the worst catastrophic consequences? And the answer there is, well, we have to go a lot faster than we're currently going, and maybe faster than we're capable of as a species. So, I don't want listeners to think this is nothing but a depressing book. Wes and I are both, I think, very joyful people. But we do believe that if we don't embrace these hard questions and start talking, um, the chances of a decent human future go down if we're not willing to face reality.
Well, one of the other things that you brought up in the book or at least in the article, which is part of the book,
Yeah.
was something to the effect of, what are you willing to give up?
Yeah.
And I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about how that intersects with the whole idea of the car,
Yeah.
because my wife and I have been wanting to get an electric car for some time so that we could visit our grandchildren without flying. And that was to create
Hmm.
a smaller carbon footprint in our travel needs. Of course, as you noted earlier, in through most of human history, your family wouldn't have gone
Yeah.
thousands of miles from you. You'd be living in the same community forever. And so now there's tons of people who have family all over the country, and giving up your grandchild face to face with your grandchild is not something most people are willing to do. So we've only got a couple of minutes for you to respond to that, and then we'll
Yeah.
take it offline on the YouTube. But do you want to try and take a stab at that?
Sure, and that's a great place to leave the conversation for the radio program because there isn't a good answer to this. We know that this increase in mobility, the ability to get on a plane or get in a car and be hundreds and thousands of miles away shortly, is very recent, and it's not going to be part of the human future. But for all the reasons you mentioned, it's hard to give those things up. So if we're going to give them up, it has to be a collective decision. Now, that means that we have to get together politically and decide priorities about how to use energy. And that's a very difficult thing. What makes it more difficult, of course, is today the distribution of wealth and power is such that a very small number of people control this. So we've got a political problem before we can deal with the ecological problem.
So we're going to continue this conversation on YouTube, but we've got to say goodbye for the radio show. And before we do, I want to let Bob take a minute to let people know where they can get more information on his writings
Yeah.
and maybe where he's going to be sometime
Yeah.
talking.
For those people in the Taos area, I'm going to be doing a reading at the Taos Library on April 19th. That's a Wednesday at 5 p.m. But a lot of my material is available online for free. And the easiest way is just to put my name into a search engine, Robert Jensen, and you have to use the Danish spelling of Jensen, Jensen. And my page will be the first one that pops up. And there's a lot of material available there, including information about this book, this most recent book with Wes, and other projects with Wes Jackson, who, again, I believe is an environmentalist that deserves a lot of attention for his decades now of insightful work.
So for those of you who are on the radio, I would encourage you when you get home to look for this recording, because we're going to talk more about Wes Jackson, who he has mentioned many times now in this interview. And I just really want to thank Bob for spending so much time with us today, and to encourage the listeners to really look into his writings and his blog. It's a very different perspective on how we can possibly survive the apocalypse. And I think it at the same time that it's dystopic and kind of bleak, it's optimistic because it shows a path for this for how society can go back to its roots, if you will, as a part of this transition that's inevitable. I mean, it is definitely coming. So thank you for listening. We'll be back again next week. Not sure who our guest is going to be. It may be just Roxanne and I doing a final wrap up on the legislative session. But stay safe, stay healthy, and above all, stay active. It's the only way we fix this mess. Okay, I'm back with Bob Jensen, and we're going to continue this conversation. And you were talking about how, humans have never had this capacity to travel
Yeah.
vast distances to visit friends and family. And so we're gonna wind up having to give that up
Mhm.
at some point. And how does how do you see that evolving? You said it has to be a collective decision.
Yeah.
Is it that families are going to have to start saying, look, where are you going to be for the next 20 years? And can we come there? Is
Yeah.
that really what it comes down to? I mean, that's a conversation this family has all the time, and we can't
Yeah.
get the kids to come up with we'll be here.
Yeah. Well, I think at thinking about kind of the big picture, I would point people to the work of another colleague at the Land Institute, Stan Cox, who, along with another writer, Larry Edwards, has proposed a very, I think, sensible approach to how to put limits on our energy use, how to reduce human consumption of energy, at least in the United States, where they're proposing this on a gradual time frame over the course of 10 years. But at the heart of that is not only a reduction, but rationing, the idea that everybody can't have everything they want. Now, we have successful examples of rationing from US history, most notably during World War II. But in this case, it's going to be a little harder because we're not talking about the imperatives of wartime. We're talking about a permanent reduction of consumption. And Stan Cox has done a lot of good work on that. If people want references to that, feel free to go to my webpage by just putting Robert Jensen into a search engine, and you'll find an email address, and I'll send you all of Stan's work. So we're talking about reduction that is collective, because of course, if we leave it to individuals, short-term desires and demands, overtake us. Now, I'm not naive. I know that even talking about limits collectively imposed through rationing is a political non-starter in the United States today, even in, progressive areas. But I think it's eventually where we're going to have to go. Let me give you an example. When I talk to people, I say, how do you feel about people who travel by private jets? 3 people get on a jet. Well, everybody's willing to say, yeah, we need a law to ban private jets. That's just not acceptable. I said, okay, what about a law that says you get one airplane ride every 5 years and you can use it how you want, but you only get one? And then people start to think of the places they want to fly, and they say, well, I'm not sure about that. And I said, well, what about a law that says you can only drive a certain number of miles every year? Well, people are even more nervous about that. But those are the kinds of questions we have to face eventually if we want a rational, planned change from high energy, high technology societies that are unsustainable to something more low energy and more sustainable.
It's interesting because I was thinking, as you were saying that, before you got to the flight analogy, I was thinking infrequent flyers. You need an infrequent flyers club instead of frequent flyers, and you get rewarded by if you only fly once every 5 years or something to that effect.
Yeah. And I don't want to stand on some, moral high ground here. For most of my life, I was hardly an example of sustainable living. I'm older, I'm retired, and I'm learning sort of the joys of staying put, which I realize is easier when you're older and retired. But the fact that, I've been a sinner, I don't think undermines the argument, because for most of us, at least most of us with the income that allowed us to travel, for instance, we're all sinners. And I think that's an important insight, that this isn't about being, a good person. We all want to be good people. We all want to do the right thing. This is about coming together and deciding how we're going to be good people together. And that's a different project than just shaking your finger at people and saying you shouldn't fly so much. That's not my goal, and I don't think that will get us anywhere. But coming together and saying, okay, how are we going to manage, again, what Wes calls this downpowering? That is an important project, and one I think a lot of people are willing to think about. But we have to have, of course, a political structure to make that possible.
I read yesterday when we were talking, you were saying something like, if you had a pile of cash, you would buy land.
Yeah.
If you had a bigger pile, you would then buy tools. And if you had a bigger pile, you would then invite young people who wanted to learn how to use those tools. Is that really about what we're talking about, to create these? I mean, someone I was talking to the other day was saying that, I think it was Jay, that there was an online discussion on Facebook about forming a co-op, a community that of people who see the world more or less the way we're describing it, and the need to create this landing spot, this community landing spot. Is that how you see this evolving, or can you see how this evolves?
Well, first of all, I don't want to be naive, because of course there was a period in the 60s and 70s, the Back to the Land movement, where you know, not to be too cynical about it, but hippies thought, well, we'll just go get some land and we'll live in peace and harmony. And of course, that proved to be a lot more difficult than people understood. But your question goes back to my reflection when somebody asked me, if somebody gave you $1 billion, what would you do with it? And my answer was I'd buy land. I would make sure that productive land stays productive and marginal land can be brought back to productivity. But it's not just enough to have land. You have to have the right people on the land with the right tools. Now, there's a growing movement, especially of younger people, who want to abandon, the sort of conventional career path that for much of my life was thought to be the good life, go get a good job, make a lot of money, get a big house, and then go on vacation a lot. Well, there's a lot of people who realize that's a dead end. But of course, getting into farming is not easy if you don't own land. The costs are prohibitive. So I like to fantasize about that $1 billion, buying land, and then finding a way to place people interested in small sustainable farming on that land and to build those kinds of communities. I'm from North Dakota, I mentioned, and there was a time, I was born in 1958, when small family farms were the norm and small rural communities were the norm. Now, I don't want to, again, be naive and say, well, everything was rosy there. A lot of problems in small rural communities sometimes. But most of those communities are gone now, right? A lot of that land has been consolidated. The idea of a family making a living on a quarter section is pretty much a thing of the past. And I don't want to, out of nostalgia, recreate that. As Wes would say, we need to recreate that not out of nostalgia, but as a practical necessity. And of course, along with going back to that more ecologically, or at least potentially ecologically sustainable way of doing agriculture, we have to think about equity because not everybody had access to land even back then. So I never talk about ecological solutions without thinking about political and social solutions, because that distribution of wealth and power in the country and in the world more generally is now very unequitable. And so we've got a lot to think about. But dreaming big is sometimes a very important part of the process of coming to small solutions. And I think land is at the core of it.
Mm-hmm. So you've mentioned Wes Jackson's
Mm-hmm.
number of times, and I think we need to meet him a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got to know Wes
Yeah.
Jackson and who he is and why
Yeah.
you think he's important?
So when I went back to graduate school, leaving the journalism industry and moving into teaching, I was lucky to meet a friend who turned me on to a lot of very important books, one of which was one of Wes's books. So in the late 1980s, I started reading the work of Wes Jackson, his first and most important book, perhaps, called New Roots for Agriculture. And there's a long story about Wes's ideas about sustainable agriculture, the move from annual grains to perennial grains, the move from monocultures to more diverse cropping systems, ideas that are not his exclusively, but he's been an important advocate for. But there was something else about Wes's work, a kind of boldness, a willingness to rethink what we thought was real. And he kind of turned my world upside down. Now, this goes back more than 30, 35 years now. And for a long time, I was simply a fan of Wes Jackson's, reading his work, listening to some of his speeches. He's a great storyteller and a great speaker. And then about 10 years ago, 12 years ago now, I got a chance to meet him and started collaborating with him. So the first project Wes and I did was a book that I wrote called The Restless and Relentless Mind of Wes Jackson, which sums up Wes's personality. He never stays still, and he never lets go of a problem till he figures it out. And in that book, I tried to summarize some of the most important insights of Wes over the course of his career. Then we worked on a podcast together that we called Podcasts from the Prairie, which was really just a kind of extended oral history of me interviewing Wes. That's still available online. We made a book out of that, and then we worked on this book, An Inconvenient Apocalypse. So sometimes I joke with Wes. He's he's won a MacArthur Genius Grant. He won the Right Livelihood Award. He's noted as kind of one of the founders of both the sustainable agriculture movement and the environmental studies movement. He chaired one of the first environmental studies programs in the country. And I always say, well, we're a good team, Wes, because you're brilliant, you're creative, and I'm a rather, plodding boy from North Dakota. So the combinations of Wes's brilliance and my organizational abilities make it a good team. But, I find Wes constantly intellectually invigorating. And I think we need people like that who aren't afraid to shake it up. Just to give you one of these Wes aphorisms, these great ways he has of bringing an important idea into a phrase or a sentence. Wes says we have to feature questions that go beyond the available answers, and I love that about Wes. And that sums up Wes. The conventional phrase is he thinks out of the box, but I prefer his idea that we have to feature questions that go beyond the available answers. There are things we can answer, and it's good to do that. But the big questions and the hard questions are right now beyond our capacity. And he says that's where we have to focus our attention. So I would recommend Wes's work. Again, it can be found on my website by Googling Robert Jensen or using another search engine. But Wes, I think, is both a very creative thinker, but a creative thinker rooted in science. He's a plant geneticist by training. He's an old Kansas farm boy. And so he brings together the practical experience of growing up in the Depression, along with, those highfalutin ideas from universities, and rolls it into a really important worldview, I think.
So I'm sure you've read broadly about the no growth and slow growth economic models, Heinberg and so forth.
No.
Do you see a way for a no growth or slow growth economy to serve as a transition or a staging place,
Mm-hmm.
or the saving remnant you anticipate?
Yeah. I think the degrowth movement, and that includes a lot of people with a lot of different ideas, I think is really central. We are going to eventually stop consuming as much as we do now as a species. And again, I want to always footnote, I realize that consumption right now is not equitably distributed. So there are people in the world, let's say 1 billion people, who right now consume too little because of poverty and longstanding entrenched patterns in the distribution of wealth. But on average, we are going to have to dramatically reduce our consumption. And I don't see how that can happen in an economic system that's premised on continued growth. So degrowth, slow growth, no growth, whether we like it or not, it's part of the human future. And the question is, do we try to do it with rational planning, or do we let the worst aspects of human nature emerge by refusing to confront this? I'm not an economist, and it's not an area of my expertise, but I do think that the people who are working on the degrowth movement are incredibly important. But let's go back to that realization, so no one thinks we're naive here. In the current political landscape in the United States, talking about degrowth is pretty much impossible, because the minute the system hits a bump, whether it's a bank failure or a Wall Street crisis or whatever, almost everybody is back to asking the question, how do we get growth back on track? Right? And so we've got a lot to overcome, not just, again, the worst of, the fat cats, the 1%, but the whole economy, including, most of the political system, embraces this same idea of growth. And that's just a dead end for the human future.
Yeah, and Naomi Klein wrote a good deal about that I'm looking for her book right now, where she really integrated the concept of economic justice and climate justice as being inextricably bound, and that there's just no way that we can survive as a species if we don't deal with that equity, because the
Yeah.
just what you just said. And it seems to me that most of the no growth, slow growth, degrowth movement, part of their philosophy embraces the collective we and the public good. And it seems to me that the transition to that kind of political philosophy and economic philosophy is the kind of environmental context in which the concept of communal living that you were laying out as part of the what comes after the collapse. It's the kind of political orientation that would at least be a reasonable breeding ground for the kinds of people we need to have and the philosophies we need to embrace in order to survive in the kind of world you're seeing. Is
Yeah.
that is that a reasonable?
Yeah. I think one way to sum that up would be to say that if we don't dramatically change our political and economic systems, right, to deal with this incredibly immoral, and I think that's the way to say it, this immoral distribution of wealth and power today. If we don't deal with that, we're not going to be able to claim to be fully human. On the other hand, if we don't deal with the ecological crises, there's going to be no world for us to struggle to be fully human in. We will have undermined the ecosystem's ability to sustain our own lives. Both things are important, and I think you're right that there's no solving one without the other. But right now, that requires some really hard thinking that a lot of people don't want to do. Let me just, let's make it real. I'm a retired professional. I have adequate income to live a moderately comfortable life. And when we talk about some of these things, people say, well, that's easy to say. You're not poor. You're not living on the edge. When you're talking about all these changes we have to make. And my answer is absolutely right. It's easier for me to do, right? And my own material comfort is the product of a system I can't, morally embrace. But the fact is, independent of the mistakes human beings have made up till now, we have to face reality. And that reality is, to go back to what I said earlier, fewer and less. How do we transition to a smaller human population consuming in the aggregate far less energy and material resources? Whether or not I'm kind of we're on YouTube now, so I can say it. If somebody said, well, you're kind of an asshole for making this argument, I would say, yeah, maybe, but it doesn't matter. Is it a sound argument or not?
Right.
And I think this trips up a lot of people on the left, and I consider myself part of the political left. I have been for the last 40 years. It's hard because those problems of equity, the incredible injustice in the world in the distribution of wealth and power, is a problem we have to tackle. But it can't be a problem we tackle independent of the recognition of that downpowering that Wes talks about.
Yeah, one of the things I was thinking as you were speaking is that to make the transition to the kind of world, the saving remnant world you're talking about, would require some kind of transition period where, theoretically, government was fostering this kind of activity in a kind of land grant kind of thing, offering grants to communities to come together and form, planning money, tool money, seed money, and land acquisition money, and a process for doing that, so that that kind of transition to that kind of lifestyle and community survival would be in advance of the total collapse of our economies and our climate. Whereas if we approach that time of collapse coming from our current capitalist society and the democracy we mispractice today, the transition is more likely to be to what we saw in the parable of the sower, and that is just I can't recommend a book to our listeners more highly.
Yeah. Let me give you an example Wes uses a lot. So as I said earlier, Wes has been really important in the idea that we need to move from annual grains, wheat, rice, corn, the crops that produce so many of our calories, which because of the realities of plowing, annual grains means a lot of soil erosion. The way we farm industrial now means a lot of soil degradation. And Wes said, well, what if we grew perennial grain crops? Right? In other words, crops that could be harvested without plowing for, let's say, 4 or 5 years. Okay, it's a great idea. Wes calls that natural systems agriculture. And at the Land Institute, which he co-founded many years ago, they're working on plant breeding. Right now, that plant breeding uses a lot of high technology, computers, and they can speed up the process of improving these grain crops with all of the energy that it takes to make, computers and the technology. And Wes says, so we're in a kind of trap. We need that energy and that technology to speed the process by which we might come up with an agriculture that's more sustainable. And he said, so, it seems like a contradiction. We're using all this energy to get to a world where we hope we need less energy. But those are the kinds of questions we have to face. We're not going to remake the world overnight. And I think right now we tend to think, and by we, I mean the political system in a place like the United States, tends to think only in short term. Right? So there's an economic crisis. There's a supply chain crisis. We don't have enough, computer chips. And so everybody scrambles to say, how can we make sure we keep the existing system running? And I realize the imperative of that, because for one thing, when the existing system fails, there's a lot of human suffering, and we can't be glib about that. But if we're going to make, more computer chip facilities in the United States, that's fine as long as the long-term goal is consistent with that downpowering, right? Now, again, I don't want to be naive. None of this is simple. Right now, you can't even have this conversation in the mainstream political spaces. But, lots of crazy ideas took a while to get into the mainstream. And I think Wes and I would argue that our book, which people could easily dismiss as saying, well, it's not realistic today, we would say absolutely not realistic today, but we're not thinking only about today. And so that's the need to overcome the short-term thinking that's kind of inherent in the modern world, especially in the modern capitalist world. Right? There's a world beyond the next financial statement.
Yeah, there are people who are able to envision it. I go back to Octavia Butler. I mean, she wrote that book in, I believe it was the late 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And, in that book, she describes this political candidate from the right whose slogan is "Make America Great Again." And she did that 30, 40 years before Trump was on the scene.
Yeah.
And all of what she has stated about environmental collapse and stuff, she projected well before it was part of the at least mainstream dialogue. Certainly we knew what was coming, but it wasn't as if people were talking about it as much as they should have.
Well, this is an interesting point because I agree, and I'm a big fan of Octavia Butler, especially Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents. Wes is a scientist, but Wes is a great advocate for the arts because he says we have to imagine, a different future, and that doesn't come from science necessarily. Science fiction that's too technology heavy, gives us ideas about colonies on Mars. Well, there aren't going to be human colonies on Mars. Octavia Butler was called a science fiction writer, but she was, to my mind, much more than that. And you're right, the prescient assessment of where the US political system was heading is almost scary, chilling when you read that book. But I do recommend the book and all of her work, partly because, to echo another theme we've been on this whole program, she talked always about the injustice, often the racial and gender injustice, along with the ecological crises. That ability to imagine tackling both the social and the ecological is really imperative. There's no decent human future, and perhaps no human future at all, if we can't embrace the need to make progress on both the social and the ecological fronts simultaneously. It's a tall order. I mean, nobody's pretending it's easy, but that's the task in front of us.
So where do you see what is the messaging that we need to be formulating to get people to see it this way? I mean, how do you get people who are so comfortable to recognize how close they are to a cliff?
Yeah. I don't tend to think in terms of messaging in the conventional sense, because I think the forces opposed to this worldview we're talking about, they're always going to have more money, and they're always going to have slicker tactics, right? I think that the awareness of what we're talking about is not going to spread as much through messaging as through real human contact. So let me again use my current situation. I live here in Arroyo Seco. We're on the outskirts of Taos, and it's a community that is partly the old Hispanic families of the area, and a lot of newer people like us, mostly gringos who came. And what's interesting is not only the differences in culture and history, but the shared values, right? For me, I see this in the Acequia meetings, right? When we get together to distribute water, and you see this range of people who have come together because of a common interest. The common interest is irrigation. We have a common, obligation to maintain the system, to treat each other fairly, right? It's not because we all have the same political principles. It's because we all live in a place that we want to see to continue to thrive. And, that more than the messaging that you might see in, media, I think is important. It's the experience of engaging with people this way. And we all get to it in a different way, in my case, I can see that, the luck of meeting a few people who changed the way I think, reading a few books, it's really hard to chart how this happens. And so I think the most important thing is for those of us who believe this to not be afraid to speak it, right? Now, people have told me, well, when I talk about this at a family dinner, everybody just tells me I'm a doomer and I should shut up. Yeah, okay. Keep talking, right? Not, dispel the notion that it's about gloom and doom. Talk about, a positive vision of a different human future. There's no guarantee everybody's going to embrace this kind of thinking. In fact, you can be pretty much guaranteed they won't embrace it right away. But when we think about how minds change, how societies change, we have to recognize we really don't know how that happens all the time. The seeds of an idea planted years ago might come to fruition when you meet somebody who has a similar, idea. You just can't predict. So I just say, keep talking, keep writing, keep, doing what you do in whatever realm that is. And I think, that radio is an incredibly important tool in this, because it allows more than just a soundbite. So programs like yours, I think, are crucial. I'm a huge fan of radio, especially community radio, and a lot of that can now be done on the web through podcasting and things. So
Right. Well, along that line, I could talk to you all day, but if I do, I'll have a 4.5 hour, 5.5 hour interview, and no one's going to listen to it.
Yeah.
So I want to call this conversation to a close, and thank you so much. And I guarantee you that this isn't our last conversation,
Great.
radio or otherwise.
Great. Well, thanks so much for both what you and Roxanne do. It's really a really important community service. So thanks so much for having me.
Thank you very much, and we'll talk soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.